Thursday 2 months ago, I stepped into the kitchen and noticed a small puddle of grayish water on the floor. A huge, moist spot of grayness covered the ceiling. I called my landlord straight away. I told her that there was a leak and that either a pipe must have burst or some water might have accumulated on the flat roof. She said she would send someone straight away. I asked whether she needed the key. She said no. I suppose that I'm an idiot. I assumed that the lack of phone calls during the day was a good sign, and that when I got home, it would all be fixed. I felt some nervousness on the ride home. The bus was slow, and my thoughts went a bit overboard. I scolded myself for being ridiculous. Far from ridiculous. From the outside, the bungalow looked fine. I pressed the key in the keyhole, turned it, and pushed the door open. Immediately, a moldy old water stench welcomed me. If you've ever had the pleasure of cleaning an old aquarium thick with algae, you know what I'm talking about. The water and debris was already in the corridor. The kitchen looked like an earthquake had struck. Pieces of wood, cement, insulation material, and chipped off paint were all over the floor. The sticky gray water covered not just the center of the room, where the ceiling had crashed, but seemed to have splattered on every single wall and piece of furniture. The old water stench by now had become a pungent smell of rot. Some of the water seemed to have flown in small trickles into every room, and there were small puddles or dried gray stains everywhere. At first, the landlord apologized profusely. Then, when the handyman came and told her that there was no pipe to fix, she blamed me instead. She said that I must have done something to the ceiling. One of the men suggested that it might have been rainwater that had trickled through small holes in the roof and collected over weeks, months, or maybe even years in the insulation material of the ceiling. I understand why my landlord was so suspicious that I'd done something. Basically, since the first week of moving in, I had complained about the paint that occasionally chipped off the walls and ceiling. Paint of so many layers that had been painted on top of one another. The bungalow badly needed a renovation, and she knew it, but she didn't want to spend any money on it. The, for its condition, far overpriced bungalow was her cash cow that she wanted to milk until the cow died, or rather, until the falling ceiling killed someone. I only stayed because it was so close to work. For 3 weeks, I had to get up half an hour earlier to make sure that I got in my shower before the builders came. In the evenings, I came home every night for a new smell. Plastic, plaster, powdered insulation material. It was hard to imagine what exactly the 4 guys did during the day. But they didn't just leave smells. They also left trash. Obvious trash that I ended up throwing out because they never bothered to do it themselves. I had to live in the mess, eat my cereal between heaps of trash until I threw it out myself. In a way, it was curious to stare at the different materials that made up my home. It was kind of fascinating to guess what each of them were used for. The black, sticky rolls were likely for the roof. The yellow, fluffy ones, clearly insulation. The wooden planks and drywall plates likely were to be part of my future ceiling. The trash was harder to identify. Of course, there was also the yellow drywall, soaked in some sort of grayish water and covered in a moldy slime. I asked the builders 3 times to get rid of it, and in the end did it myself because just the sight of it made me feel sick, not to mention the smell. I pulled the slimy yellow marshmallow-like material into large black bags and put them outside. It was at the bottom of the heap where I found the white bag. I call it a bag because I don't know what better to refer to it as, and it was my first impression that it must be a bag. But the texture was different. It was flexible and strong like a bag, but it also seemed to have some structure. A scale pattern was pressed into the material. I hated the builders. I hated that they used my bedroom for their smoke breaks. I hated that they ate my food, and particularly my bread, during the day. I hated that they left pee on the toilet seat and soiled, dirty water all over the apartment. I was happy when they finally finished. The ceiling looked like a patchwork because the landlord felt I was the one who should do the paint job. The kitchen and corridor were a mess, and a few persistent spots of sticky mass were on the kitchen counter and outside the front door. But all in all, I was happy to be on my own again. For 2 days, I lived in the mess. Then the weekend came, and I finally had time to clean up. I spent 4 or 5 hours on cleaning the apartment. I got neither rid of the old smoke, nor of the all-permeating smell of moldy old water. Still, after those 4 hours, I sat in my armchair, and for the first time in weeks, maybe even months, felt relaxed. Truly relaxed. To the core. I fell asleep like that. I woke up at 3 a.m. because the light was still on. I made my way to the bedroom and nearly had a fit of rage. There was water on the floor. Grayish, slightly thick water. The ceiling looked perfectly fine. No holes, no dripping, no wet spots. I wiped it off and checked the walls as well as the floor for any possible leaks. Nothing. By 4:30 a.m., I was finally in my bed. Every night, a few more puddles of grayish water appeared. I told the landlord about it, and she had a go at me that I should be more responsible. At that point, I made the mental decision to move out. But only now that's really a conscious decision. Only now that's really a fact. It took me a whole month to overcome my denial. The puddles were always in the same places. At the foot of my bed, right next to my door, at the entrance of the bathroom, and at several places in the kitchen. Mostly the fridge. There weren't any leaks, and the air wasn't moist enough to create whole puddles of liquid, and even less to create puddles of grayish liquid. After a week, I had found the common pattern. First, I looked for repeat spots in order to figure out where the leaks or stored liquid in the ceiling were. There were the 3 spots I mentioned already, but still occasionally there were wet spots in the middle of the corridor or near the back door. In the second week, when I knew the repeat spots, I watched the ceiling and surrounding areas closely. Still, there was no sign of any liquid seeping through the cracks in the ceiling, and certainly not enough to form a puddle. During the third week, I gave up on the puddles. I made sure all windows were locked, and I made sure that I had checked all the suspicious areas for signs of moisture. But honestly, work was exhausting, and I just didn't want to think about any of it. I didn't even bother wiping the puddles up unless they got too big. I felt hopeless. The smell had soaked through my clothes, and even at work the smell seemed to come out of my skin as if I myself were filled with dirty grayish water. At the end of the third week, the puddles suddenly stopped. There was nothing more. I wondered probably more why they disappeared than I wondered why they'd been there to begin with. Still, all I felt was relief and happiness, a deep sense of liberation. I slept well again. 6 days in a row, the puddles were gone. That brings us to today. That brings us to the reason why I'm in a hotel I can't afford. When I woke up this morning, I smelled it right away. It was more pungent than ever before, and in between the smell of stale, rotting water was something else. Something fresher. A note like sweat. On my way out of the bedroom, I stared at the huge puddle in disgust. It led straight from the door to my bed and continued behind the door into the kitchen. There was also a branch of thinner spots towards the bathroom. I wiped it up straight away. I knew I would be late for work, but I just didn't want to come home only to expect to see more suffocating liquid soaked into the cheap floorboards. I started in the bathroom because it felt like the easiest. Then I made my way to the kitchen and wiped the liquid up. I had to change the cleaning water 2 times to get rid of all the gray marks on the floor. Finally, I got back to my bedroom. It was definitely the worst of the rooms, and I wondered why I hadn't woken up from the noise that the flood of liquid surely must have produced. I had just changed the cleaning water for the 3rd time when I realized that the puddle continued under the bed. I pulled the blanket up and pushed my bed towards the far corner. The bed moved. The puddle seemed to have spread even larger under the bed. Suddenly, something white appeared. Something white and thin, like a plastic bag. The wrinkled and ripped textile was soaked full of grayish water. In size and shape, it was only a bit smaller than me. I pushed it around with the mop, A corner folded over and I saw a piece of bread. A piece of fresh bread right next to the top of the white bag. It took me nearly a minute to recognize where I'd seen it before. I recognized it because of the scale pattern. Then it took me only a second to realize what it was. Not a bag. A shed skin.